Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. Hey, we are continuing in that unit that's called More Than a Sidekick, Serving Alongside Others. We're in the third lesson. It's going to be on David. The focal passage is 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 5 through 16. And the point of this lesson is this: serve with excellence, even when that work is not appreciated by others. Well, before David became king of Israel, he was a servant of King Saul. And David accomplished great things under Saul. But the king's jealousy caused him not to appreciate David as he should. Well, let's look at our first set of verses. That's in 1 Samuel 18, verses 5 through 8. And here we see that whatever mission King Saul had for David, David was successful. And this caused King Saul to quickly promote David through the army ranks. And you might think this would cause some jealousy among the troops, but it didn't. Both the troops and the officers were pleased with David and his accomplishments. And just like there were celebrations and ticker tape parades that happened after World War II, there were celebrations in the streets upon the return of David and his troops from a successful campaign. Musical instruments and it accompanied the singing and dancing celebrations. And the song that was sung by these Hebrew women when the troops came marching back, it was only 5 Hebrew words. But those 5 words really packed a punch. And here's how those words read in English. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Wow, that might sound like a slam against King Saul. But there's some things to consider. First of all, Saul is mentioned first, and in Hebrew poetry, that's a place of prominence, okay? So he had that going for him. Also, now this is a similar pattern that's found in the first part of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 32. And it says this: how could one man chase 1,000 or 2 put 10,000 to flight? But here in this Deuteronomy passage, the writer there is stating that thousands of unfaithful Israelites could be conquered by just a handful of their enemies. Could it be that these women didn't mean to elevate David's accomplishments above Saul's, but instead they reworded that Deuteronomy passage and was saying that instead of them being chased by the enemy, God was blessing them through Saul and David, and they were able to suppress the enemy? Okay, possibly so. Well, let's continue on in the story looking at the verses that follow in 1 Samuel 18, verses 8 through 11. So whether or not it was what the women were meaning, Saul took their song to mean that he had been slighted. And that's what happens when we are full of ourselves. We interpret the things that people say about others through our own egotistical and insecure lens. To think that David was being credited with 10 times as much as Saul, it enraged him. Theodore Roosevelt is credited with saying, "Comparison is the thief of joy." Let's camp out there for just a minute. In our social media culture, it is so easy to see the perfect pictures that people post of their happy lives, which might leave you wishing you had their life. But here's the thing: people usually post the best things in their life, and that's usually with a filter. So we only get to see their mountaintop experiences. So to compare the reality of one's life to the filtered life of someone else, what we see online does not do us any good at all. When we compare, we are evaluating our everyday and mundane to someone else's absolute best, and there's no winning in that. Many in our Sunday school class went to see the Jersey Boys, the story of Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, and we went to this area dinner theater this past weekend. And while many would envy the success and fortune of the members of that group, the musical Jersey Boys gave a little behind-the-scenes look at the heartaches and the struggles and the relationship issues that occurred within those guys. Here's what happens when we compare ourselves to others. If it's to someone who isn't as good at something as we are, if I'm better at something and I compare myself to them, well, that leads to pride. But when we compare ourselves to someone who is better at something than we are, okay, that leads to envy. And envy can lead to anger, which is exactly what happened to Saul. We'll see where that anger led him in just a minute. Well, Saul's statement where he said, what more can he get but the kingdom? That indicates that Saul realized that David was good at what he did, and he had the admiration of the people. What else was left for him but to become king? It's kind of like a boss with an outstanding employee whom everyone likes, and the boss is threatened and thinks, wow, he must be out after my job. Well, verse 10 might be troublesome for some of those in your group. So let's make sure we address this head on. Don't try to avoid it, because if you do, somebody's going to bring it up. So it states here that an evil spirit sent by God came on Saul. Well, James 1:13 through 17 tells us that not only is God, he doesn't tempt people to do wrong, but that every good and perfect gift comes from God. How can we reconcile these New Testament verses with an evil spirit that God sent? Well, first, even though the term evil spirit is how most translations render that term, the adjective evil is interpreted differently by the following translations. In the ESV, it's called harmful. In the New King James, it's called a distressing spirit. In the New Living Translation, it's called a tormenting spirit. So there's that possibility to consider. Also, let's remember that God is completely aware of everything, even before it happens. And so for whatever reason, he allows some bad things to happen. We know that in our own lives, don't we? We can look to the story of Job for biblical proof of that. When the author penned the term sent by God, he could have meant that God was aware and allowed that spirit to come upon Saul. Also think back to the story of Noah and the flood. Genesis 7:4 shows us that God sometimes sends destruction or things that we would characterize as evil. The verse in Genesis states that God was the one who sent the flood waters with a specific purpose of destroying most living things on earth. Sometimes he initiates things like that as a means of punishment. But God could have used this evil spirit as an opportunity for Saul to realize his need for repentance. Now, this is kind of similar to a parent taking away a privilege from a child, using that as an opportunity for the child to see the error of his or her ways and ask for forgiveness. So you may not want to delve into all this explanation, but I would suggest to be prepared for that, because if you don't address it, somebody in your group probably will ask about that. And you know what? The next part of the verse can be just as troubling as well if you're reading from the New International Version, the NIV, as I do. Of the major English translations, 29 of those use some form of the word prophesy or prophesied, while 23 used a form of the word rave. So, was this evil spirit causing Saul to utter prophecy? Okay. Well, that word prophecy or prophesy here, it indicates or describes an ecstatic condition due to a supernatural influence, whether that's a good or an evil influence. So it's safe to say that the Lord was not speaking through Saul and the king was prophesying here. No, based on Saul being visited by this evil spirit, we can safely say that the better term would be ranting, especially because of what happens next. What happens next? Saul took a spear in his hand and tried to kill David. But David, fortunately, eluded this attack. Remember what we said earlier? If unchecked, comparison leads to envy. And if that envy isn't stopped, it can lead to anger. And anger can lead to murder. James 1:17 echoes this thought when it states, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. This would be the first of several altercations between Saul and David. Saul tried to kill David at least 8 times, either directly or trying to get somebody else to do it. Well, what was David doing when Saul tried to kill him with a spear in our story this week? He wasn't antagonizing the king. No, he was doing what he was supposed to do. Back in chapter 16, we see that David was summoned to play his lyre, that's a kind of a harp, to soothe the king's mood. That's what he was doing here. But obviously it didn't calm Saul this time. Saul allowed his jealousy and his envy and his fear to get the best of him, and he tried to eliminate the person whom he believed to be the source of his feelings of inadequacy. Well, let's look on to our final set of verses, 1 Samuel 18:12 through 16. And here we see that Saul realized that the Lord's favor had left him and was now on David. So Saul allowed David to continue as a military leader, allowing him to lead over 1,000 troops in various campaigns. So here's the question. If Saul was fearful of David, why did he continue to promote him and use him? Why not banish him from his sight and send him back home to tend sheep? Well, let's examine there for a minute what might be going on in Saul's mind. He realized that God's favor now rested on David and not him. He tried to kill David, and that didn't work. Or maybe if he sent David into battle as the leader, the enemy would kill him. Problem solved. By the way, isn't that the same approach that David took with Bathsheba's husband? Send him into battle to get him killed, into problem. But if the enemy defeated David and David lived, his popularity in Israel would definitely wane. But you know what? With Saul, neither one of those things happened. David was successful in all that he did because the Lord's favor was on him. This caused Saul to fear David even more. But through all this, David was faithful and loyal to his boss, the king. He kept doing what he was supposed to. He didn't try to undermine Saul or try to get a coalition of men to get on his side. In fact, 1 Samuel 24 records the story of David having the opportunity to kill Saul, but he refused because Saul was the Lord's anointed. Well, around 25 years ago, I had a friend give me this book. It's A Tale of Three Kings by Gene Edwards. It deals a lot with the Saul and David conflict and how David didn't undermine the Lord's anointed. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that book helped me navigate through a very dark time in my ministry when I was working for a pastor who was my King Saul. For whatever reason, we just didn't seem to gee-haw. No, that's just an Arkansas way of saying we just didn't get along. In my own opinion, in my own humble opinion, I'm a pretty nice guy. I'm easy to get along with, but for some reason that wasn't happening with me and my boss. So after almost 4 years of working there, a couple of members of the personnel committee met with me and said it would really be best for me to move on. Boy, was I hurt and mad. What I wanted to do was gather supporters and tell my story, get people on my side. But you know what? I didn't do that. In fact, in the closing paragraph I wrote in a letter to the pastor after that meeting, and I copied the personnel committee on it, it said this: "Please be assured that I continue to support you as pastor and will not do anything to undermine your authority. I'll continue to work hard and be my normal, goofy self around the office and in church." Well, more than a year after I left, one of the janitors emailed me and said he had just heard the story of why I left and that he had no idea. Well, I don't say all that to be braggadocious. Really, I don't. But to show that even in ministry, people get hurt. And sometimes the thing the flesh wants to do is to strike back and to get even, to tear down the other person. Or maybe sometimes people just want to sit back and see how much they can get away with, taking that attitude of, well, if they aren't going to appreciate me, then why should I even try? But what does the Bible say in Colossians 3:23 and 24? Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. So let's remember the point of this lesson. Serve with excellence, even when that work is not appreciated by others. And if you know of someone, or maybe it's you, who's been hurt by the church or church leaders, I really do recommend this book. Well, next week we're going to be looking at David's friend Jonathan in 1 Samuel in chapters 18, 19, and 23. Thanks, guys, so much for watching. I do appreciate you. Continue to pray for and with your class.